Awful news, my gentle and of course very modern apes. I awoke this morning to find that I still haven't quantum leapt into a reality where contested bones does not exist. I am stuck here, sharing a realm with this cursed text. So I guess we'll just have to continue to go over it together, right? Contested Bones is a book that is attempting to debunk human evolution and the entire paleoanthropologic record, and it is written by two guys, neither of which are paleoanthropologists or members of an adjacent field, which is really awesome. Where we left off, we're getting ready to discuss Section 1, Bones of the Human Type. Now, you might be, wondering to yourself, what does that mean? And that's a really good question because I'm also wondering what it means. Let's see if they give us a little bit of criteria. Now, as you might guess, moving forward, we'll be covering bones of the human type and then bones of the ape type. And then there's one last category that Contested Bones wants to cover, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Today, however, we are tackling the chapter that begins the bones of the human type section, which is on Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis. Let's get started.
See how the surf grows, and they give it all they've got, and they give it all they've got, and you give it all you've got, and you know. See how the brain gets when you fall inside a hole you couldn't see. When you fall inside a hole inside of someone, help me understand what's going on inside my mind. Doctor, I can't tell if I'm not me.
Section 1, Bones of the Human Type. Introduction to chapters 3 through 5. In this first section, we will be examining the hominin bones of the human type. I just put criteria because if you're wondering, no, they do not go over what the criteria for the bones of the human type are. Because many paleo experts, for those of you not keeping track, this is probably my 7th or perhaps 8th ulcer, derived from the usage of this word. Because most paleo experts are splitters, there are many species in the Homo genus. Most significantly, paleo experts recognize the following human species: Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis. There are more than that, but we'll get there when we get there. Splitters would argue that there are many more Homo species. However, most lumpers would say that all of these subgroupings reflect variation within a single species, i.e., they are all Homo sapiens. We agree with the lumpers. So I put 2 question marks under there and I just wrote, what? Because no, I can think of not one single paleoanthropologist who thinks genuinely that the solution to the problem of genus Homo, which is so rife with fossil material, that the solution is to call everything within it Homo sapiens. And the primary reason for that is because there is so much morphologic diversity and they are geographically found all over the globe. But again, we'll get there when we get there. As we discussed, the slightest anatomical difference is sufficient basis for splitters to declare the discovery of a new species. Indeed, it is not unheard of for a new hominin species to be declared on the basis of a single broken bone. I just put when. Like, give me an example. If there's so many, well, then say one then. While a splitter might argue that there are over a dozen Homo species, a lumper might say there is just one Homo species. Yes, a lumper might say that. If we are categorizing Sanford and Roop as the only lumpers who would say this, then technically lumpers might say that. Yes, officially, technically, the best kind of correct. For instance, one group of paleo experts known as multi-regionalists tend to be lumpers and maintain that over the past 2 million years, only one hominin species has been in existence, Homo sapiens. Multi-regionalists, especially under the term multi-regionalism, have not been in vogue for perhaps 50 years. They are saying that Homo sapiens includes many variants, including various people groups that splitters would call separate species. This would include Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, Homo georgicus, Homo antecessor, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rhodesiensis, Homo helmi, Homo floresiensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo denisova. Distinguished paleo expert Chris Stringer confirms multi-regionalists often regard Homo sapiens as the only human species on Earth during the last million years. So species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis have no real meaning for them. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. The old version of the multi-regional hypothesis and the out of Africa hypothesis were kind of pitted against one another back in like 1980s, mid to late 1980s. In 1983, Wolpoff proposed the multi-regional hypothesis, and Chris Stringer is a fan of the out of Africa hypothesis. These two would go toe-to-toe for quite some time. But once we kind of got the genetics, the multi-regional hypothesis, as it appears here, was booted pretty hard. Because what multi-regional effectively states, as seen in this little diagram, is that Homo erectus leaves Africa 1 to 2 million years ago, localizes in several different places, so Africa, Europe, Asia usually, so China and Indonesia, as well as, I guess, eventually Australia, and Homo erectus kind of, through convergent evolution, evolves into the modern quote-unquote races that we see today. That's the old version of the multi-regional hypothesis. This was compared with the out of Africa hypothesis of old, which stated that humans came from what is effectively an African variant of Homo erectus, which did in fact leave Africa 1 to 2 million years ago. The African variant stuck around, where it eventually evolved into Homo sapiens, perhaps through several other species, we're not 100% sure. And then it leaves Africa, right, somewhere between 100,000 years ago, maybe 70,000 is more appropriate. And then Homo sapiens, an archaic version, settles in various places in Europe and China, Indonesia, Australia, and of course back in Africa. So the truth of the matter is, like, you look at this and you're like, okay, out of Africa seems more reasonable, but a modern version of the multi-regional hypothesis has kind of come to light. And Chris Stringer, the out of Africa guy who was going toe-to-toe with Wolpoff and who's being authority quoted here, would call this a modern, weak version of the multi-regional hypothesis, which basically takes the out of Africa stance, but it does so twice. So it would say that Homo erectus leaves Africa, settles in a bunch of different places 1 to 2 million years ago, and that Homo sapiens does the same thing much more recently. So 100,000 years ago to 70,000 years ago, just like out of Africa, right? But that these two can still interbreed, right? So even though Homo erectus left, 1.9 million years potentially earlier than Homo sapiens, to as little as just 0.9, that they can still interbreed with the Homo sapiens that just left Africa. So, okay, how does that make them the same species? Well, it doesn't. That adheres to a version of the species concept called the biological species concept, which basically states that if it can hybridize, they're members of the same species, or rather hybridize and produce viable offspring, then these two, the two parents are members of the same species. Okay, so this doesn't work today, and I'll tell you why. Because lions and tigers can hybridize and produce viable offspring, and so can polar bears and grizzly bears. And by viable, I mean a growler bear, or a cross between the two, can itself produce viable offspring with members of either species. Okay, so what's the deal? Why bring all this up? Because contested bones is hijacking the modern version of the multi-regional hypothesis and plucking in some classics from the multi-regionalism of old, the Wolpoffian multi-regionalism, in order to try to make a case that actual paleoanthropologists think that Homo erectus is just Homo sapiens and that everything after it is also just Homo sapiens, so that they can effectively try to, dismantle evolution from the inside out. Well, again, that only works if you're appealing to the biological species concept, one, which we know does not work today, which is why most people don't adhere strictly to the biological species concept. But the second issue with that is the fact that we don't really know that when Neanderthals and humans crossed, if the offspring was always 100% viable, which would violate even the biological species concept. It seems that it depended on whether the human part of this duo, of this ancient lovers affair, was male or female, and whether or not the Neanderthal was male or female. Some crosses would work and some perhaps wouldn't. Now, humans are less closely related to Neanderthals than Denisovans is, so Denisovans probably could more reliably produce hybrids, but again, that doesn't mean that they're not distinct species. And we'll get to that a little bit more in a second, because if there's anything creationists are known for, it's creating special standards for humans that they won't apply to other species. But first, I thought it would be interesting to pull up Chris Stringer's year after what they're quote mining here in 2013, his 2014 statement from Trends in Ecology and Evolution titled, "Why We Are Not All Multi-Regionalists Now." And the highlights are basically, he's making the multi-regionalist modern version / contested bones hijacked argument and then explaining why it doesn't work. So the highlights: DNA data shows that archaic introgression into modern human genomes occurred. So that's just stating that humans and Neanderthals interbred and humans and Denisovans probably interbred as well. Such introgression is claimed to support the multi-regional model for modern human origins. This introgression is also claimed to support the lumping of distinct human species into Homo sapiens, but comparing models and data still validates a recent African origin model for modern humans and the use of a restricted diagnosis for Homo sapiens. So basically saying, yeah, when you take all of this together, this kind of newfangled version of the multi-regional hypothesis is still bowing down to out of Africa classic. Now, Wolpoff is still alive and is effectively the primary guy who's still pushing the multi-regional hypothesis, sort of in its modern adapted version, perhaps because he was the one who came up with it in the first place. By and large, again, I can think of no paleoanthropologist who holds that Homo erectus should be Homo sapiens, as should everything descended from it, wherever and whenever it may do so. So the boys continue on. There are 4 strong arguments for lumping these slightly different skeletal forms, I put Lamau underneath that, into a single group. Number 1, all the extinct Homo forms clearly display modern human anatomy from the neck down, apart from some aberrant skull types which have very reasonable explanations. I put, oh, okay. All these skeletons have a body shape that is clearly different from all living apes and all Australopith-like fossils. Okay, so spoiler, and you'll see this later, but these guys don't think that Australopithecines were bipeds. They think that these guys were like knuckle walkers or perhaps palmagrade, pronagrade, arboreal primates, which is just indefensible at every single level. Australopithecines could not be these quadrupeds, knuckle walking or otherwise, biomechanically speaking. Every trait physically that we have that allows us to maintain this, facultative to obligate bipedality, and indeed backwards through the hominins, is present in Australopithecus of all varieties. So therefore, by Sanford and Roop's, first set here, their first definition, Australopithecus would just be a part of this lumping, right? So they would be modern humans or fully human, whatever it is that they use terminologically, quote unquote. 2, this group is distinctly human in having unique designs that enable highly optimized functions. I just put, what does this mean? As we will see, only humans have just the right anatomy to enable graceful upright walking, see there it is again, deft handling of complex tools, inborn competence for speaking complex languages, and inborn ability to think in a truly human way. Okay, so upright walking, Australopithecines did that. Handling tools, Australopithecines, probably did that too. There's good reason to believe these guys were using tools much like modern chimps do today, but perhaps even slightly more advanced. Inborn competence for speaking complex languages, we don't even know that Neanderthals could speak for sure. So if this is their criteria, then all of those Homo erectus onward hominins that we just lumped in have now been lumped back out. And an inborn ability to think in a truly human way. This is nonsensical gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. Okay, number 3. The human-like bone types are consistently associated with artifacts that disclose cultural hallmarks of modern man. For example, they used and carefully fashioned tools, utilized fire, made artwork, ceremonially buried their dead, and could sail impressive seafaring vessels against an open ocean current. And I, okay, all of them? Really? That's fascinating. I would love to see support that Homo erectus was sailing. Please show it to me now. Also that they, ceremoniously, buried their dead. Right? Where is that? I was unaware that Homo erectus buried its dead. I wasn't aware that was something that, I guess Sanford and Roop, know all the in guys, right? They probably know a bunch of unpublished material, paleoanthropologists. Okay, number 4. These groups quite clearly intermated with each other and produced hybrid populations. Infertility is the classic proof that anatomically variable groups still belong to the same species. I put, All of them? Really? Interesting. Homo floresiensis, the 3-foot-tall hobbit, is interbreeding with Neanderthals, even though it lived in, on an island in Indonesia by itself. Fascinating. Could humans interbreed with Homo erectus, like Homo sapiens? Right? We already know that they had trouble with fertility when they were interbreeding just with Neanderthals. So how are they going to go back even further than that? And then that last sentence. Interfertility is the classic proof that anatomically variable groups still belong to the same species. Again, I point you to polar bears and grizzly bears, lions and tigers, right? Wolves and dogs, coyotes and wolves. But yes, of course, they're all the same species. These 4 points constitute compelling evidence that all these hominin bones of the human type were indeed fully human and were not ape-human transitional forms. Okay, then just end the book then. I'm just kidding. We can't do that just yet. The first section describes Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal, Homo erectus, and Homo floresiensis, Hobbit. So, we talked about this already, but erectus isn't shortening Homo erectus by very much, but it does make you significantly less professional looking. So, perhaps don't nickname the binomial nomenclature of, hominins when you're trying to disprove the foundation of their evolution, right? All right. Homo habilis, and Homo naledi will be described separately in section 3. Bones of the middle type, which is your spoiler for the third category of hominins that they will be discussing in this book. Because there are, of course, bones of the human type, which are things that they think are completely human, bones of the ape type, which are bones that they think are non-human apes, because I don't think humans are apes, and then bones of the middle type. That shouldn't exist as a category if they are correct in that it is very easy to make these discrete categories of human and ape. Right, that is, I put problematic because that's simply what it is. All right, so we're going to jump right into Neanderthals with Chapter 3, Homo neanderthalensis, the first hominin bones. They quote from Clive Finlayson, "The irony is that the scientific community is going to have to come round to the acceptance that the Denisovans and the Neanderthals also belong to the species which we all call Homo sapiens." This is a quote from, it looks like December 31st, 2010, so right around when the Neanderthal sequence genome came out. I wonder if Clive still holds this position. But one thing that is important to note is that if you want to call Neanderthals Homo sapiens and Denisovans Homo sapiens on the grounds that they could interbreed, you run into the two issues of, one, now we have to call polar bears and grizzly bears the same species because they can as well, and two, you have to show that Neanderthals and humans, not only did they interbreed quite frequently, but that the offspring was consistently viable as well, which I don't know that you can show with any certainty, but we'll, I'm sure, get there. So, Neanderthal was initially used as a nickname for the non-mineralized skull cap and few associated bones and bone fragments which were discovered in the Neander Valley of Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. This was the first set of bones to be considered a pre-human hominin. These few bones became popularly known as Neanderthal man. The quotes we cite below will use both acceptable spellings, okay? The second spellings reflect the most common pronunciation. Okay, cool. All right, I put "this is okay" here. I wonder how long that will last. Since the first discovery, many skeletons have been found displaying similar characteristics. These bones are collectively described by the paleo community as Neanderthal and are typically given the formal designation Homo neanderthalensis. However, an increasing number of paleo experts prefer to prefer to classify Neanderthals as Homo sapiens. I put decreasing, actually, thanks to the work of Svante Pabo, who actually sequenced the Neanderthal genome. Over the past 150 years, there have been considerable debate regarding the status of Neanderthals. Were they a brutish-looking missing link between ape and man? Were they a separate subhuman species that went extinct, an evolutionary side branch, or were they fully human, Homo sapiens? Generally speaking, the paleoanthropology community has come to regard Neanderthals as an extinct variant of man. I just put no, because that is not the common view in the paleoanthropological community, and I know that because I'm in that community. No, most people do not think that Homo neanderthalensis was Homo sapiens in the sense that the guys at Contested Bones are proposing, right? And part of this has to do, again, with the genetics, not just Svante Pääbo's work, but additional work that shows like how the genes between our two species actually intergressed with one another. We will get there when we get there. The point is that they're mischaracterizing this. No, people do not think that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are the same in the sense that they're proposing. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are said to evolve from a common African ancestor about 650,000 years ago. This age estimate is based upon the sequencing of DNA within the Neanderthal bones and a number of different mutations compared to looking to modern humans. This type of molecular clock dating will be discussed in an upcoming book. I put LOLOK. Molecular clock methods require questionable assumptions about mutation rates. The first European Neanderthal fossils are thought to be 400,000 years old based on uranium series dating. Okay, nearly 500 Neanderthal skeletons have been discovered at 124 sites located. Okay, they just discuss like where a lot of these fossils were found. I put fine with a smiley face. Neanderthals are not significantly different from modern man from the neck down. I put wrong. So what you're looking at here is from Tattersall. What's the date? 04? No, it's later than that. Tattersall 2012? Something like that. It doesn't matter. We'll cover this paper at length later. On the left is a Neanderthal, so Homo neanderthalensis, and on the right is Homo sapiens. As you can see from the outset, they do look very similar, much like lions and tigers do. So this is a lion skeleton here to the right, and that is a tiger skeleton. Notice that they are indistinguishable from the neck down, and yet I would imagine Sanford and Rope would consider these two to be different species. But I digress. With this Tattersall example here, you can see that Neanderthals are definitively more robust. They have a broader rib cage. Their legs are actually shorter for their body size. And while these guys are kind of scaled, Neanderthals were actually significantly shorter on average than humans. They were about 5'2" as a pooled sex average, and humans are about 5'8"-ish as a pooled sex average from archaic populations. So that's a pretty big difference. In weight, though, they beat us out as well. Their average weight was like something like 160 pounds, so like 70-something kilograms, and for humans it was like 140. So, significantly heavier and significantly shorter too. So to say that postcranially they are just identical is simply not true. They don't fall within the archaic human variation for either height or weight, even for pooled sex. So that's a bit interesting if you give it a second to kind of ponder. They go on for a minute trying to write off the differences between humans and Neanderthals postcranially, and they move on to note that the contact zone between Homo sapiens, archaic versions, and Homo neanderthalensis is extensive and long-lasting, providing ample opportunity for interbreeding. This is true. Although, and they note this right here, recent genetic analysis has confirmed what many paleo experts have long suspected, that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were interfertile and interbred. Neanderthal genes are present in modern populations. The DNA of Europeans and Asians contain approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. So this is true. Again, harken back to what I said earlier about how the ability to interbreed, at least in current times, is not consistent and not consistently applied to actually delineate what a species is. There's more to it than that, and we'll get to what Ian Tattersall kind of thinks with regard to what a species definition is that can work both today and through time, but the biological species concept doesn't work in either. So keep that in mind. Additionally, 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, that's really low if these guys are literally the same thing, as in they are the same species, how we consider it today. This would suggest to me that, one, it seems to only be going one direction. We'll talk about this a bit later, but Neanderthals don't seem to have very much, if any, introgression of human genes into their system, into their genomes, which is quite strange. It suggests to me that while interbreeding occurred, it didn't occur very often. Recently, paleo experts, well, there's another one, my doctor's growing increasingly concerned, have classified a new form of Homo which lived alongside both Neanderthals and modern humans. In 2008, bone fragments were found together with Neanderthal bones in the Denisova cave in southern Siberia. They're talking about Denisovans. And then they have a figure here that says replica of a finger bone fragment from Denisova cave in Russia, replica of the Denisovan molar that was recovered, mitochondrial DNA was extracted from each of these fossils and sequenced. I put an arrow there and said, the point. That's the point. The DNA was sequenced and they were found to not fall within the variation of at least modern humans. We are all 99.9% similar to one another. These guys are, well, in the case of Neanderthals, we'll talk about Denisovans in a minute. Neanderthals are about 99.7%, so outside of our extant range of similarity from the two most distant humans, right? So what really distinguished the Denisovan bones was the DNA extracted from them, which displayed distinctive mutations. They continue onward, describing, the methodology behind it, and then they hit us with, in our opinion, Denisovans were simply a genetic variant of Neanderthals. Just as Neanderthal DNA has been found within Europeans and Asians, traces of Denisovan DNA appear to be present in people groups living in Southeast Asia. However, when considering ancient DNA evidence, caution is required because ancient DNA is usually highly degraded. They're like covering their asses here. We're going to talk in a minute about how that is just reprehensibly untrue, that Denisovans is derived from Neanderthals. Because these guys split off around 400,000 years ago or so. They're sister species. One does not descend from another. And believe it or not, you can actually, this is characteristic within genomics, right? You can tell when something descends from something else, whether it's nested within a lineage or falls alongside it. We'll get there because these guys are just objectively wrong again. I know. I'm shocking you with all of this, with their repeated lack of informedness, if you will. So they say Denisovans and modern humans, as well as Neanderthals, were all members of a large interbreeding metapopulation, and so we're just all variants of Homo sapiens. I put, oh brother, because that's just not supported by the literature at all. But we will continue. Over the years, it has become increasingly evident to the paleo community that Neanderthals and Denisovans were fully human and very much like us. Fully human is nebulous throughout this entire book. You will never get a definition or a list of criteria for what fully human even means. The Neanderthals are said to have gone extinct roughly 30,000 years ago. However, the latest DNA evidence indicates that Neanderthal populations never truly went extinct, but rather was assimilated into other human populations. Again, this argues that Neanderthal was Homo sapiens. I put, this betrays a lack of education for several different reasons. So their source 12 here comes from 2010. So this is actually from the draft of the Neanderthal genome. So they're basically citing when Neanderthals effectively went extinct. That's fine, right? We're cool with that. And then for citation 13, they note they've cited from 2014 the quote, in that sense and in the light of genetic evidence revealing interbreeding, Neanderthals did not go extinct, even though their distinctive morphology did disappear. So let's track that down. So tracking down the paper, you get the full context, which is here. Genetic studies now suggest that the debate on the demise of the Neanderthals needs to be reframed in terms of some degree of interbreeding. In that sense, Neanderthals did not go extinct, even though their distinctive morphology did disappear. We will return to this topic at the end of the paper. And if you continue downward, you will get a very nice kind of summation of what they think happened with Neanderthals and why they went extinct, which I think is pretty good, is a pretty good summary. Let me see here. All right. Right here. The Neanderthal demise appears to have resulted from a complex and protracted process, including multiple dynamic factors, such as low population density, interbreeding with some cultural contact, possible male hybrid sterility, and contraction in geographic distribution, followed by genetic swamping and assimilation by the increasing numbers of modern immigrants. So effectively, what they're saying here is that Neanderthals weren't just assimilated because they are literally the same thing. They didn't go extinct because extinction usually implies that every trace of a species is effectively gone, doomed to the fossil record. Clearly, because we have the DNA of 1 to 4% of the genome of Neanderthals, they aren't entirely extinct. In that sense, they haven't gone extinct. But it's important to note that it's only in that sense. Their morphologic distinctiveness is entirely gone. And effectively, Contested Bones argues that there is no morphologic distinctiveness. So their own source, again, is nay-naying them in this sense. Also, it notes here that their demise, which of course is pretty much synonymous with extinction, in the sense that extinction it includes that the distinctiveness of the species is in fact gone, that the reason Neanderthals effectively went extinct is due to several different things, including their low population density, so they're living in these small pockets, interbreeding with some cultural contact, the possible male hybrid sterility, and the fact that their range was shrinking, so contraction in geographic distribution. So after all of that happens and really gets them down to a vulnerable level, then they get genetically swamped, and what's left of them is assimilated by the increasing number of modern immigrants. So these immigrants may have been hybrids, or they may have been humans, right? Or they could have been, Denisovans. Probably not the last one. But it's important to note that, again, this paper is not in support of Sanford and Roop's claim here, and they really quote-mined pretty hard by saying that Neanderthals didn't go extinct in the sense that there's still 1 to 4% of them genetically still around. If you really want to make that argument, then there are, millions of organisms that haven't gone extinct because their genetics exist in some shape, form, or fashion in modern populations of organisms. Okay, so then they get mad. They're mad. This whole section is called the Dehumanization of Neanderthals, in which they are upset that Neanderthals used to be depicted as these kind of brutish, sloping over, stooped kind of savages, if you will. So let's pull that up. Neanderthal original depiction. Neanderthal original depiction. Yeah, so they've got these real kind of apish qualities. They're covered in hair, they're slumped over, they've got this highly prognathic face, and some of these traits are indeed legitimate, right? Modern Neanderthals are depicted much kinder, right? They do look much more familiar to us, but the primary difference between them in their older depictions is really, frankly, the amount of hair that they're covered in, right? This Neanderthal, which is in Contested Bones going to be shown as this very unflattering, very incorrect depiction, is not actually all that wrong, and we will get to that momentarily. So they continue onward, talking about how they're mad that Ernst Haeckel, who is described as a German biologist and radical Darwinist, proposed the name Homo stupidus, partially in jest, about Neanderthals, like what they should actually be called. So they talk about, they cite here modern paleo expert, Ian Tattersall. And they note that Ian Tattersall says, from the anatomy of the leg bones, Freypoint and Lohest came to the conclusion that these individuals had walked upright but with bent knees, just as, in fact, apes do when they stand up. Thus started the myth of the bent-kneed Neanderthals, a myth that was to endure for more than half a century. This is at least in the sense of sort of the general public, because one of the original paleoanthropologists, right, like folks who were spending time looking at hominins, Sir Arthur Keith, said from the very beginning that Neanderthals, while they are certainly a different species, were artisans. They weren't simply brutes. And that was back in 1915 in his book, I think it's The Antiquity of Man. But let me pull it up here just in case. Arthur Keith, Ancient Types of Men, in 1911. So that's actually not the one I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of his 1915 version. But he noted that Neanderthals were not direct ancestors of humans, and you can tell that he's coming from like a place of sincerity, because he covered all of the other hominins that were there and kind of covered them in different ways. He gave only Neanderthals this kind of creativity at the level or close to the level of humans, of archaic humans. So they stay mad, they're continuing to get mad. They show a lot of the pictures that I've shown here, and they note that, they're doing a lot of old citations, just so you're aware. We've got a whole bunch of 1900 citations here, because of course they have to cite older sources if they're going to propose that people incorrectly think that Neanderthals are kind of more primitive in some of their anatomies. They cite this guy Boole, right? And they say Boole's faulty reconstruction was undoubtedly influenced by his evolutionary preconception that Neanderthal man was a descendant of apes and unrelated to humans. Modern paleo expert Eric Trinkhaus acknowledges this, writing, Boole, like many of his contemporaries and many subsequent human paleontologists, let his preconceived evolutionary notions unduly influence the interpretation of functional morphology so as to provide an overall reconstruction of Neanderthals that fit their perceived evolutionary relationship to modern Homo sapiens. He was able to do this and convince the discipline that his reconstruction was accurate, and then they cut off the quote. So this is citation 19 from, looks like 1941 or 1985, depending on, 1985. So that's a citation from 1985. Cool. Then they say the Smithsonian Natural History Museum tells of Boole's fraudulent reconstruction, stating, and I underlined fraudulent and put implies intent. So this implies that Boole intentionally portrayed Neanderthals as being, these big apes, effectively, these very primitive ape-like hominins. Boole grossly misrepresented Neanderthal more than a century and a half ago, yet his ape-like caricature of Neanderthal man is still deeply embedded in modern human culture. As Tattersall acknowledges, the skeleton of the quote-unquote old man from La Chapelle is now thought to be 50,000 years old, which is misinterpreted by Marcel and Boole in 1908 to 1911 to yield the classic caricature of the Neanderthals as shuffling, bent-kneed brutes. To this day, illustrations and comic movies commonly portray Neanderthal man as subhuman. I would really like to see what comics are illustrating Neanderthals, and then I would like to read them. It is only very recently that museum displays and artistic renditions of Neanderthals have begun to change. The general public and scientists outside the paleo community are still largely unaware of what real Neanderthal man looks like. And then they compare Neanderthal depictions, specifically that one that you can see reflected in the back with a representation of a child, a Neanderthal child. So no, these two things are not equivalent, because Neanderthal children, due to their neoteny, will look more like humans, because humans, Homo sapiens, are characterized by extreme neoteny, even more so than Neanderthals are. So that's a bit deceptive in my opinion. Okay, so then they continue. These paleo experts could not ignore the fact that Neanderthal clearly had an anatomy that was fully human. Yet again, what is the definition of fully human? Can we please get some criteria here? This is supposed to be what? What'd they say? The level of a PhD dissertation? And we're not defining our terms? Huh? They even show a picture from the paper I showed you guys from Tattersall earlier, where they show a side-by-side comparison of complete Neanderthals and complete humans. Neanderthals were thicker bone with larger joint surfaces and had differently shaped skulls, yet their overall anatomy is unmistakably human. And I put still no criteria. This view eventually carried the day within the paleo community. Neanderthal expert Eric Trinkhaus lists in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology numerous scientific communications and publications dating from the 50s until recent times that have all confirmed what is now widely accepted in the paleo community. Quote, the total morphologic pattern of Neanderthal axial and appendicular remains, which comprises the entire skeleton, was fully compatible with the erect posture and bipedality of modern humans. So, what does that statement mean? It means that Neanderthals were orthograde bipeds and nothing more. I'm going to read it again. The total morphologic pattern of Neanderthal axial and appendicular remains was fully compatible with erect posture and bipedality of modern humans. That means they moved like we did, and they stood like we did. It does not mean that they are modern Homo sapiens, but they continue after this, saying there is now unanimous agreement within the paleo community that the real Neanderthal man was anatomically human. Now, I want you to appreciate that constantly in this book, it seems we are saying human as in genus Homo, and we're using human as in genus Homo when we're plucking our sources from the quote-unquote paleo community. But when Sanford and Roop are saying human, they mean what is effectively modern Homo sapiens. these two things are not the same thing, and that's a very slippery tactic. They're taking, the definition used by paleoanthropologists, and then they're changing it in media res in the middle of things as they change it over into their usage in the book. Their version of human does not mean Homo. Their version of human means effectively modern Homo sapiens. Okay, Eric Trinkhaus, foremost authority on Neanderthals, has concluded, detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans has shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. That is from 1978, 1. 2, no one has ever said in the paleoanthropological community, pretty much past 1980s, that Neanderthals weren't upright walkers, right, that could use a wide variety of tools, although not up to the level of archaic Homo sapiens. Even still, this is the case. And that they didn't have high cognition, right? Could they speak? We don't know. Could they manipulate the world around them? Were they environmentally dominant in the same way that archaic Homo sapiens was? We don't know. But their morphology is distinct, and we'll get to that again more later. Okay. While some paleo experts still maintain Neanderthal as a separate human species, a growing number argue that Neanderthal was fully human and interbred with Homo sapiens, and therefore was Homo sapiens. This sentence also needs to be dissected. While most paleo experts, I would say, maintain that Neanderthals are a separate human species, a growing number argue that Neanderthal was fully human and interbred with Homo sapiens. This is true, but then they take it to the next level and say, and therefore was Homo sapiens. That's an add-on that Sanford and Roop have given, right? Yes, the majority of the paleoanthropological community think that Neanderthals accept that Neanderthals interbred with humans, and that they also interbred with Denisovans, and that humans interbred with both, right? But that does not mean that they were Homo sapiens. That is a conclusion that they are applying to the general sentiment of the paleoanthropological community, because most of the paleoanthropological community doesn't accept the biological species concept. Most biologists don't accept the biological species concept. It's used roughly to explain the concept of species to children, and no more than that. The biological species concept, I put aha, is the most widely accepted definition of a species and was developed by Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr, the same Ernst Mayr that we've already dunked on in this text, before, that Sanford and Roop don't like. Okay. The biological species concept states that if members of the same or different populations are able to interbreed and produce fertile progeny, then they are considered the same species. Stop. We don't know that all hybrids between humans and Neanderthals were fertile. We don't know that, right? Perhaps the 1 to 4% is more ancient, back when, earlier, closer to the human-Neanderthal split. However, since Neanderthals are no longer living, the biological species concept did not seem directly applicable. Then they talk about how, humans and Neanderthals interbreed because we have their genetics. Again, this is true. And then they compare humans and Neanderthals to different breeds of dog, except, right, humans and other humans are 99.9% similar, just like the breeds of dog are, and just like dogs are to wolves. Dogs and wolves are approximately 99.9% similar. More similar than humans are to Neanderthals at 99.7%. And yet, creationists, I would assume, would consider wolves and dogs to be different species, right? And humans and Neanderthals to be the same. This is inconsistent, which is, of course, the reigning theme of the Neanderthal chapter. The morphologic species concept, i.e. the assumption that superficial morphological distinctiveness indicate reproductive isolation and hence justify separate species status, have been thoroughly falsified by the recent sequencing of Neanderthal DNA. I don't know anybody in the paleoanthropological community or otherwise that thinks that the morphological species concept is an appropriate species concept to use both horizontally and vertically through time. I've just never met anybody like that. And I'm taking hominin evolution seminar class right now with a guy who actually works with Bernard Wood, or has worked with Bernard Wood. And we did a whole section on the species concept. And you want to know what the conclusion was? That there is no species concept that works ubiquitously, right? So I don't know why these guys seem to think, oh, well, I do know. It's because they're not trained in paleoanthropology or paleontology or ecology or general bio past, the bachelor's level in the case of Root. Okay, Neanderthal features seen in modern humans. Human individuals living today display classic Neanderthal features. If the same traits can be found in modern humans as well as early modern Homo sapiens populations, then there's no rational basis for continuing to treat Neanderthals as a separate species. I don't know why they're arguing this. They've already made the case that they're going to use the biological species concept. Now it seems that they're saying not only are Neanderthals human in the sense that they're Homo sapiens because of the biological species concept and interbreeding, but also because their morphologies aren't distinct enough. We are going to talk a lot about this right now. The former world champion boxer Nikolai Valuev, also a member of the Russian parliament, happens to display Neanderthal-like features in the skull. He has a sloping forehead, heavy brow ridges, and characteristic of a Neanderthal. His chin is modern, but if his skull cap were found as an isolated bone in the fossil record, as most Neanderthal skull caps are found, a splitter might misclassify him as a separate species. Like a large part of the human race, Mr. Valuev probably carries Neanderthal DNA, and then they show a picture of this guy. Let's see if I can show it to you. Of this guy. So, it is incredibly foolish to think that the only things that distinguish humans from Neanderthals are the brow ridge or supraoccipital torus, and of course the chin, right? That these are the only two things that distinguish them. They cite Cartmill and Smith, saying the most pervasive empirical reason for doubting that complete reproductive isolation occurred in this case is in the existence of specimens with mixed morphology. Some of these are fossils of early humans found in or at the edges of Neanderthal homelands, which exhibit features of the skeleton otherwise characteristic of Neanderthals. Then they end the quote. So this is from 2009. Neanderthal features that can be observed in modern humans are seen in the postcranium below the neck as well as the skull. They say there is no clear definition of what constitutes a modern human skull. There are always aberrant human skulls that fall outside the proposed ranges of human morphology. As Cartmill and Smith write, most of the definitions of modern human that have been proposed are either too vague or too useful to be, too be useful, or too narrow to encompass the range of modern human variation. An all-encompassing definition may be impossible. So they go on and they say the problem with this characterization of Homo sapiens, which they list a morphology here that says, in spite of these difficulties, generally accepted features of modern human skulls are as follows: rounded high vertical forehead, reduced or absent brow ridge, projecting chin, smoothly curved occipital bone, lacking the protrusion at the rear of the skull, and a less projecting lower face. Paleo experts have attempted to distinguish Homo sapiens on the basis of these commonly shared traits and have used these traits to exclude Neanderthals from Homo sapiens. And then they say it's too narrow because a number of modern human skulls fall outside of the accepted human range. Then they say, for instance, there are a number of Australian Aboriginal skulls that do not meet the typical standard of modern human criteria, yet no one doubts that they are fully human. And then I just put ha at the end of this. So we're going to talk about this in just a moment. I'm going to talk about how Neanderthals have, or how Aborigines have Neanderthaloid features. This is pretty much just talking about their brow ridge, right? So let me make sure that there's nothing else here before we jump into it. Nope, there's still more. Okay, they talk about the Mount Carmel region remains, which are approximately 100,000 years old, that are found with anatomically modern human skulls. So they're basically saying, oh, they're contemporaneous. Then they use a quote from 1939, which states, "We are of the opinion that the variability found amongst the fossil people of Mount Carmel is greater in degree and in kind than is to be observed in any local community of modern times. Had the Mount Carmel people been discovered not collectively but in one place, or not collectively in one place but separately in diverse localities, each excavator would have been convinced that a new and separate form of humanity had been unearthed. So does one Carmelite individual differ from another." So then they say, they acknowledge that if the bones had not been found together, they would likely have been classified as belonging to separate species. It is too easy to underestimate the extent of variation in the human form and thereby exclude certain skull types from their rightful human status. I put bizarre. And then they talk about Jebel Qafzeh, which are two skulls that are dated from approximately 92,000 years old. And they're human, so they're anatomically human, or rather they're archaically human, but they do have other robust features. They have large brow ridges, they have a thick cranial vault. But Sanford and Roop say that the skulls exhibit that these are Neanderthal features, but they're not distinctly Neanderthal, right? We're going to talk about this a lot in just a second. And then they bring up one more example from the Czech Republic. It's all basically saying the same thing, that we can find archaic humans with Neanderthal features. Okay, cool. Then they say, Huxley correctly suspected at the time of Darwin that the morphological boundary used to distinguish Homo sapiens and Neanderthal skulls was arbitrary. I put on the side, this is species in general, right? Then they show a picture of the skulls from Jebel Qafzeh, right? So these are two skulls in northern Israel that show combination of Neanderthal and anatomically modern traits. I think this is almost done. Okay, yeah, cool. That's it. Let's talk skulls. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the big differences first. As you can see in this picture over here on the left is an anatomically modern Homo sapien skull, and over here on the right is a Neanderthal skull. Right away, what I hope you notice is that Neanderthals have this massive supraorbital torus that does not taper out to the sides. Its zygomatics are swept back instead of coming forward, so that's this kind of right angle shaped bone. It makes up your cheekbones, and in this picture here you can see it a bit better. The human skull here, it's pictured to the right, and the Neanderthal to the left. The Neanderthal zygomatics sweep backwards instead of coming directly out at a right angle, and this is actually a derived trait, right? Chimpanzee skulls have a zygomatic that goes to the side like a human skull does, as opposed to Neanderthals, which have it swept back. The Neanderthal has a swept back forehead as well that slopes rather than this vaulted forehead seen in humans. And the human skull has this globular shape, while the Neanderthal is platycephalic and dolichocephalic, which means, it's kind of squashed downward and it's very wide, right? So it's kind of like obvious right away, some of these differences. The human skull has this chin, while a Neanderthal does not have a chin, right? It lacks it entirely. The Neanderthal midface is prognathic, so it sticks out quite a bit more than that of the human. And Neanderthals also have this little structure in the back called an occipital bun, right? That humans obviously lack. When it comes to the face, there are some additional differences, right? So Neanderthals, they have this massive nasal aperture, right? So the whole of their nose is just enormous. They would have had very large noses. And their sinuses actually extend. You can't see it very well here, but their sinuses actually extend quite a bit in the midface as well, which means they lack a canine fossa, which is something that humans do have. You can see it over here. Humans have the canine fossa. Neanderthal faces are puffier, and they lack it. And in this picture, you can also see that they've got this nice ridge for their supraorbital torus, whereas the humans, they have a much thinner brow ridge in comparison. Neanderthal teeth have what's called beveled wear, so you can't see it as well because the human is lacking teeth here, but their wear is kind of on the front of the incisors. That's super strange. Nothing else really has wear like that. They also have a retromolar gap, so they have a gap at the back of their third molars, which is right here. You can see what looks like a retromolar gap for this human skull, but that's actually because the wisdom teeth are taken out. So you see 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and only 2 molars. This skull has just lost its wisdom teeth. So let's see, what else do we have? I've got my notes here just in case. I wanted to look at anything else. The occipital bone is associated with the flattening of the lambdoidal area, right? And they also have a fossa that's associated with that sloped back forehead. So fossa is kind of a depression. So they have a depression here, whereas humans don't. This is because humans have a vaulted forehead that comes forward, and the Neanderthal forehead moves backwards, leading to this depression right behind the brow ridge. Humans can sometimes have a hemibun, which is not a true occipital bun. We talked about the midfacial prognathism, we talked about the canine fossa, we talked about the aperture, we talked about the zygomatics, we talked about the supraorbital torus, and we talked about the shallow sulcus behind. I called it a fossa just now. It's not a fossa, it's actually a sulcus that is this little brow ridge depression here for Neanderthals that humans lack. And these guys have mandibles. This skull over here has mandibles as well, but you can see it best kind of from the front and from the side. Obviously, Neanderthals lack a chin. They have that retromolar gap. They also have what's called a medial pterygoid tubercle, which you can't see very well here. And if you can see their mandibles, their condyle right to the front, which is actually, what is it called? Their condyle, which is in the back. That's this guy right here, is actually shorter than the coronoid, which is the reverse in humans. So in humans, the condyle is tall, the coronoid is short. In Neanderthals, the coronoid is tall, and the condyle is actually short. The teeth. Whew, oh boy. They have Toradont molars. Oh, let me see if I can pull up a Toradont molar for you here. Toradont molars. So they have Toradont molars, which just suggests that they've got this big, heavy pulp cavity that kind of comes down, and only Neanderthals have this. So Toradont molars would be like over here. Humans have these like little cynodont molars with these big, tall roots of the teeth. They also have hypocone expansion of the molars. That just means their cusping is a little bit different. And they have, I already talked about the beveled wear and the shovel-shaped incisors. And if you're wondering why I'm consulting my notes, it's because some of this stuff I don't normally talk about, and it's because I just learned about it in my hominin evolution seminar class, which is only for graduate students. I wonder if Sanford and Roop took that class. So the point that should be abundantly clear to you for this part is that their anatomy of the skull is not slightly different, but is actually significantly different, right? And Neanderthals are actually more derived in some cases, right? So they are quote unquote more evolved in some cases than even the humans are. Compare this to the difference between a lion and a tiger skull, which are comparatively, strangely enough, seemingly more similar than the human and the Neanderthal skull, and yet these are very clearly different species, as are humans and Neanderthals. So let's talk about their examples that they brought up. The first example that they brought up is a skull that is actually called Skull 5 from Israel. Both of these are going to be from Israel. And what Sanford and Roop say is that this skull has a mix of human and Neanderthal traits. Wrong. Some archaic human traits are actually they're ancient traits, and Neanderthals just also happen to have them. This would be things like that large brow ridge that sits like a nice bar of bone on the top. That's, we find that in Homo erectus. But you'll notice that this skull right here, which is considered to be human, has a bunch of apomorphies that only humans have and Neanderthals lack. For instance, the chin. Only humans have that chin. It lacks the beveled wear of the incisors. It's prognathic more so than humans, but less so than Neanderthals. It's got a tall vertical forehead that doesn't slope back as much as what we see in Neanderthals. The zygomatics are to the side. It's got this nice globular shape to it that lacks an occipital bun in the back. If you look at it from the front, I guess which would be here, it's got a big nasal aperture, but nowhere near as big as what we see in Neanderthals, and it does indeed appear to have a canine fossa. So it has all of the traits, a lot of the apomorphies that modern humans have, not all of them, but a lot of the ones that will come to be found in humans, and it's missing many of the apomorphies that are found in Neanderthals, so that would be their diagnostic characteristics, which means this isn't a mix of human and Neanderthal traits, but rather is more likely just an archaic human, which is why it's classified as archaic Homo sapiens and not a Homo sapiens Neanderthal hybrid, which would be something that these guys would know if they gave it even a little bit of research. Here is the other one that they list, which is Quoth-ze-6, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing. And again, this one to me looks even more Homo sapiens than the previous one. Sideways zygomatics, not very prognathic, even less so than Skull 5. It has a brow ridge, but it's got that vertical forehead that doesn't slope backwards as much. Nice glob shape again. No occipital bun. No beveled wear on the incisors. The nasal aperture is not enormous. It has a canine fossa. I mean, guys, come on. This does not look like a Neanderthal, right? It's not a Neanderthal, and it's not a mix of human and Neanderthal traits. It's an archaic member of Homo sapiens. So, if you're curious, I pulled out the whiteboard and I noted that these are the two that appear to be mix of human and Neanderthal, and neither of them are a mix of human and Neanderthal. Again, showing that the author Sanford and Roop of Contested Bones did not bother to do their research. I want to finish the morphology stuff with the Ian Tattersall paper from earlier, and I want to finish down here by the conclusion with this morphology. So, First, he notes, what is more, the sheer scale of the morphological differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens makes it vanishingly implausible that both could fall within the envelope of modern, or rather morphological variation within a single species. I have pointed out elsewhere that osteodental differences between primate species classified within the same genus are typically subtle, and that among mammals in general bony distinctions on the order of those that separate Neanderthals and modern humans are commonly associated with different genera. So what he's saying is that the differences between humans and Neanderthals would probably land them if we were using standardized methods within different genera. So different genus, not different species, even more different. And then he says over here, in recognizing species in the fossil record, there is, as pointed out, no silver bullet that will ever demonstrate absolutely definitively that two closely related lineages are historically individuated, as species must be. In principle, then, no claim of this kind, or indeed to the contrary, can ever be proven. But science is fortunately not about proof. It's not about proving your case. The beauty of science is its mutability. And it's more about the preponderance of evidence, and that's the approach advocated here, that makes ineluctable the conclusion that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are properly regarded as separate species. And then he basically says more difficult is going to be looking at the Neanderthal clade and properly parsing that out. So Tattersall would, of course, conclude that they are different species. He did so in another paper, which this is the details of the morphologic and historical individuated entity that is Homo neanderthalensis, and he basically just goes over much of the same stuff that I've already touched on. So let's move forward knowing sound in our understanding that Neanderthals are morphologically very distinct from Homo sapiens. Okay, so they continue on by talking about contemporaneity of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. That means they lived at the same time, at least for part of the history of both species. Okay, this is not an issue. They talk about the pit of bones, which suggests that Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and potentially Homo erectus all lived at the same time. Maybe some of that stuff is a little bit inconclusive as far as what belongs to what species. Certainly Neanderthals and certainly Homo sapiens. Homo erectus, we'll see. But what I'm really interested in is this DNA analysis confirms that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, because this is true. Let's see where this takes us. So they say the discovery of the first Neanderthal man in 1856 sparked a century-and-a-half long debate surrounding the question of whether Neanderthals were fully human or a separate subhuman species. Not subhuman species, whether or not they were a different species. Though that doesn't imply less, that doesn't imply lesser than. Much of the debate has centered on the question of whether or not they interbred with early modern humans. That's a question that was asked, but the ability to interbreed, remember, does not necessitate that two things are the same species. That's only under the biological species concept, one of perhaps 40 species concepts that exists. This includes bones displaying a mixture of Neanderthal and anatomically modern traits. As we showed, that is simply not true. Cultural evidence showing Neanderthals had integrated with modern human populations, fossil evidence showing Neanderthals and modern humans were buried together as in the same grave sites, and controversial mitochondrial DNA analysis of the first bones recognized as Neanderthals. However, the results of the mitochondrial DNA analysis were argued to be inconclusive evidence of interbreeding. Yeah, so they were like, we're just not sure yet, we'll see. Most paleo experts dug their heels in and argued against the probability of gene exchange and argued complete reproductive isolation between Neanderthals and modern humans. I'm sure some did. However, a milestone study published in the prestigious journal Science, thank you for informing us that it is very prestigious, in 2010, and a number of subsequent DNA analyses seem to have settled the debate once and for all. Here we go. So, Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo, current director of the Department of Genetics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, is the world's foremost authority on Neanderthal DNA sequencing. In 2010, Pääbo and his international team of researchers published the first ever nearly complete Neanderthal genome. It is arguably the most significant accomplishment in the history of paleoanthropology research. Pääbo writes, many would say that a species is a group of organisms that can produce fertile offspring with each other and cannot do so with members of other groups. That's the biological species concept. From that perspective, we've shown that Neanderthals and modern humans were the same species. And from that perspective, we've shown that grizzly bears and polar bears are also the same species and always have been, same with lions and tigers. The Neanderthal DNA was extracted from a well-preserved Neanderthal specimen, so they talk about kind of like how this has gone down. And they say the human and Neanderthal samples were so similar that investigators were concerned about contamination between the two. The researchers concluded Neanderthals fall within variation of present-day humans for many regions of the genome. Yes, I would imagine that they do for many regions of the genome. We are very closely related species. But as you're going to find in a second, many regions does not equate total genomic similarity. And in their total genome, they fall outside the range. We are 99.7% similar to Neanderthals and 99.9% similar to each other at the farthest distance. In a press release, the National Human Genome Research Institute commented on the results of the study, stating, Neanderthal DNA is 99.9% identical to present-day human DNA. That's what I just said. Again, that is problematic for you, not a good thing. But the way that they've phrased this, the way that they've laid it out, makes it seem like that this next sentence is confirming the prior, in which they said many regions are very similar and fall within human variation. Yes, some regions of chimp genomes, depending on what kind of section we're looking at, if it's just like basic protein coding stuff, right, fall within human variation. These findings confirmed earlier suspicions based on cultural and fossil evidence that Neanderthals interbred with the ancestors of modern-day Europeans and Asians. In the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, researchers confirmed Neanderthals did contribute to the modern human gene pool, with all humans being able to trace their ancestry beyond sub-Saharan Africa, carrying Neanderthal DNA making up around 1 to 4% of the genome. Cool. We've already touched on all this. Talked about some of the traits that might come from Neanderthals. Then they talk about Denisovans and how people from kind of Southeast Asia have a lot of Denisovan DNA. And then they say, in Nature Reviews, Pablo explains multiple instances of gene flow, now documented among hominin groups, show that modern humans were a part of what one could term a hominin metapopulation, or that is a web of different hominin populations, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other groups that were linked by limited but intermittent or even persistent gene flow. Yes, this is all true, right? There was gene flow between the populations, although significantly more of Neanderthals into humans than humans into Neanderthals. Why that is, I don't know. But what Pablo is saying is that you could term this as a metapopulation of interbreeding hominins at these occasional contact lines, right? And then it could have been, intermittent or occasional, or it could have been persistent. We're not sure. As far as I know, the fact that there's only 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in humans today, when they went extinct 40,000 years ago, suggests that this was probably intermittent, because if this interbreeding was occurring a lot, we should see a much higher proportion of their DNA still within us today. Okay, the irony, blah, 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 I already said that was just the quote at the beginning of the paper from Clive Finlayson. Okay, so then they say, put together, this evidence showed that us humans formed an interwoven network of populations with varying degrees of gene flow between them. Some humans may have looked quite different from each other, revealing a combination of adaptation to local environments and genetic drift, but it does seem as though these differences were not large enough to prevent genetic interchange. I have suggested that humans at any point in time in our evolutionary history behaved as a polytypic species. They consist of an array of regional populations clustered into geographical races, which had not achieved independent species status. They could exchange genes when they met. And this is not a new idea either. The great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr proposed it for human species as far back as 1950. An obsession with turning each new fossil into a distinct species has clouded the biological reality that we are now retrieving. So, let's talk about this, because I have quite a bit to say. And after this, we move directly on to archaeology, and then that's the last section of Neanderthals. So I want to talk about this for just a moment. So setting aside that there's been a lot of kind of quote mining from contested bones, remember they're conflating their version of what a human is with the anthropological definition of what a human is, and contested bones also takes the stance that the biological species concept is indeed the correct one, which would, I can't say this enough times, mean we have some serious revision to our species status of multiple organisms today in the present time, right? Because we know roller bears occur naturally in nature. This is sometimes an additional thing that people will apply to the biological species concept. They'll say two organisms of two parent species, right, can produce viable offspring with one another, and they will do so in the wild. So it's not just that they can, it's that they will. This has happened with polar bears and grizzly bears, more so now that climate change is driving polar bears further southward into the territory of more southerly bear species. It's also happened in the wild with lions and tigers. So this means that when they do meet, they will interbreed. This is precisely what the current hypothesis is for humans and Neanderthals, that when they intermet, sometimes they interbred, but that their ranges weren't always overlapping, leading to intermittent at our arcturial conservative estimate, or frequent at our more frequent estimate of interbreeding. But we also know that certain types of hybrids, the ones with Neanderthal moms and human dads, might have been sterile, which suggests that the ability to interbreed between humans and Neanderthals might have actually been worse than what we see with polar bears and grizzly bears. Setting all of that aside, right, setting all of those issues to the side, as well as the fact that they are morphologically more distinct than many organisms we consider different species today, both cranially and postcranially, what would it mean for creationists like Sanford and Roop if these two things were related to one another, which of course they are, right? What does that mean for them? What does their acceptance that Neanderthals are related to humans mean? Now, they want to say they're the same thing. It doesn't matter whether or not they want to consider them the same species or not, because further genetic work has been done, and I want to talk about it. Okay, so what does Sanford think about hominins, right? Sanford is one of the authors of the book. What does he think? Well, Sanford is kind of the main promoter of this idea called genetic entropy. So that looks something like this. He would suppose, and he's supposed this in other places, right, that here's our progenitor pair of, Adam and Eve being created, they mind their own business, sin happens, and then the genome starts to degrade, right? It starts to become considerably worse than it was in this perfect situation up here. And as a result, humans split off into multiple different groups, and these respective groups diversify into the hominins that we know of today, probably up to Homo erectus, and they don't really like Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, but we'll get there. And that humans also just continue. Homo sapiens just continues to be Homo sapiens, because they would say all of this ultimately is Homo sapiens. But, these would be Neanderthals and Denisovans, or I guess I would say Neanderthals and Denisovans, Naledi, erectus, whatever. And that all of them eventually go extinct because they got bad genes, and that humans have survived until this point, right, over the course of 6,000 years. This is impossible genetically, and I want to show you why. So this was Svante Pääbo's work of Green et al. 2010, and it was the original sequence of the Neanderthal genome. Now, basically what they did is they took several different samples from fossils, from more recent fossils, and they composed a draft genome from 3 individuals, right? And then they compared it to modern humans, specifically from 5 different main groups from different parts of the world, and they found that Neanderthals were more similar genetically to people from Eurasia than they were to people from sub-Saharan Africa. Cool, okay. So more recently, in 2016, we get reconstructing the genetic history of late Neanderthals. And this is one of their phylogenetic figures, right? Phylogenetic relationships of late Neanderthals. Now, what you're looking at here is a Bayesian phylogenetic tree, right? And they've done bootstrapping here with their little numbers so that you can see really how confident they are in these relationships. 100, that's pretty dang confident, right? And notice that most of these higher numbers are located at these big main splits, right? So you have ancient and present modern humans, ancient and present day modern humans, and then respectively for mitochondrial, Y chromosomal, and nuclear DNA. And we have this enormously confident phylogenetic relationship showing humans as a sister species. So Sanford's chart, right, that Homo sapiens is actually the ancestor of things like Neanderthals, and that Neanderthals come from this degraded form of perfect Homo sapiens, is definitively not true, right? These guys are monophyletic groups. So you might be wondering, well, how certain are we? And my friend Walker, Just a Walking Fish from the channel, Just a Walking Fish, whom you should subscribe to, went ahead and actually, in a debate with an unknown individual, did the math for us here. He went to the supplementary material from this exact paper, from the Extended Data Table 2, reconstructing the genetic history of Neanderthals. I'm gonna move this over just so you can really appreciate what he's done here. And what he has done is he has shown us that taking the z-score and looking at its p-value is effectively equal to 4 times 10 raised negative 236. this is effectively, right, the quote-unquote likelihood that we are not looking at Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as a sister species. Not even this is excluding the potential probability that Neanderthals descend from humans, right? This is just the probability that effectively, and probability, well, I'm using the wrong terminology here, but that our phylogenetic relationship here is actually incorrect, right, and is only the result of noise. So, needless to say, right, Sanford is standing on nothing. There is no way that he can make the argument that he makes, that eventually, that humans are this progenitor group, and that they, through degradation, yield all of the hominins. They have to be sister species, definitively, right? What this means too, right, is that this solidifies the relationship between, potentially, in my opinion, the distinctiveness of these two groups as species, right? Because every single human, ancient and modern, is more closely related to each other than any is to Neanderthals, right? This would not be the same for, say, breeds of dog, right? Well, actually, no. Mostly it wouldn't be the same because you got things like mutts. That's a bad example, but this is, in my opinion, quite solid for these two being separate species. Now, what is a species, right? Ian Tattersall argues that it's an organism that is morphologically distinct and maintains this distinctiveness through a long period of time. Neanderthals existed for several 100,000 years before humans did, before even archaic humans came onto the scene, splitting off from the common ancestor of us both. So I would say that yes, by Tattersall's definition, which is the only definition that can be appropriately applied to living organisms and extinct ones, that humans and Neanderthals are in fact separate species. So, genetically, what's our take home here? That humans and Neanderthals are close. We are very close relatives to one another. Not as close as dogs and wolves, right, which are distinctly separate species from one another, or perhaps coyotes and wolves, which are distinctly separate species from one another, but we're close, right? And we nest within our own specific groups, and we share a common ancestor far back in time. But we also have 1 to 4% of their DNA. Now, is that a lot? Not really. It's not a lot if you're trying to make the argument that we are, we were this one single massive population continually interbreeding with one another. What it suggests to a lot of people is that there was something of a selection against many of the Neanderthal genes, because perhaps later back in time, or deeper into time, there were more Neanderthal genomes. There were definitely more Neanderthal genomes, more Neanderthal genes in archaic human populations. So, that's kind of our takeaway from this genetics section. And I'm gonna bop back on over to our big mode. With the genetics, their only option is to go with this. You have to have a common ancestor that was created by God however long ago they want to say, and then it diversifies into different hominin groups, and then humans are the only survivors, right? These guys have all gone extinct in the meantime. Pretty much only Todd Wood holds this. He is, of course, by no coincidence, the most progressive of the young Earth creationists. But it's important to note that the entire basis of trying to make Neanderthals humans in this book was to try and tie them as close to Homo sapiens as possible to be this degraded form of them, which is not something that can be argued. Now, the last thing that they really go over here in this text is they talk about archaeology. They literally have like several pages of archaeology. They have this one where I said a lot of no's. I put a lot of no's there. This one here, this whole 2 pages. And you'll notice I really didn't mark it up that much. And then this one here, and I've got a note up here, where they are effectively just saying Neanderthals did all of the cognitive stuff humans did. Right, they are just doing the same stuff as humans behaviorally. And they give a list here that says tailored clothing and footwear, sewing, windbreaks and shelters, living floors, personal adornment, cosmetics, caring for the injured and sick, ceremonies for the dead, and spirituality, abstract thinking, human language, fireplace hearths, strategic hunting, planning and foresight, cooking and filleting, sophisticated stone and bone tools, and multi-part weapons. So most of this is probably accurate. I'm not trying to cast shade on Neanderthals, although there was a difference in the type of sort of tool technologies that we used more in the more recent past, right? Humans obviously kind of sped ahead, cognitively speaking. But the more important part here is that behavior is completely inconsequential to species. And that's why I didn't make any notes on it. I was like, oh, okay, we're talking about behavior. None of this matters to the question of whether or not humans and Neanderthals are the same species. Many organisms that are different species behave very similarly to one another. I will throw back to my constant example of some of our big cats, some of our bears, some of our canids. This is just very common. Birds are the same way. So that's just completely nonsensical to me and does not matter, which is why I didn't note it. Although the one thing I did note is that these behaviors that they've listed up here, that I just read to you on page 49, that these behaviors emerge slowly. They don't just pop up. They don't appear as soon as Neanderthals appear, right? They become more advanced, almost like the species using them is evolving, behaviorally speaking, thanks to increases in brain case size and other things. They also have, I skipped some of them, they also added cordage, not making, controlled use of fire, manufacture of pitch, drying of fresh meat, symbolic communication, sculptures, musical instruments, and highly varied diet. Again, some of this is really, really scarce support-wise. The musical instruments thing, I don't know very many people who hold to that, for instance. And then they end it by saying, conclusion. Neanderthal was fully human, right? And I put this is dumb, right? Neanderthals are fully human. Since the time of Darwin, Neanderthals have been proclaimed to the world as a subspecies of human separately, unworthy of the classification Homo sapiens. Okay, it's not personal, guys. We're not bullying Neanderthals. However, there's now compelling evidence from numerous sources that Neanderthals were fully human and should be classified as Homo sapiens. Neanderthal anatomy is overwhelmingly modern. I just put no. I hope I expressed appropriately to you that that's perhaps the dumbest thing in this section, and most undersupported. As the paleo community now universally concedes, no, absolutely not. That is just a bold-faced lie, right? I guess it's not a bold-faced lie so much as it is intentionally misrepresentative, because the paleo community, it just makes my mouth taste like battery acid, would definitely agree that Neanderthals were bipeds and that they had a stride and locomotion styles similar to humans, right? But they're taking that and saying that the anatomy was wholly modern. False. We have so many differences, both cranially and postcranially, with Neanderthals, again, as I hope I showed, perhaps more so than many of the extant species today have with each other, who we consider quite unique and quite distinguished from one another. So that is just, that leaves me not feeling happy. The most notable differences are confined to the skull. However, those features are seen in certain skulls belonging to Homo sapiens from various sites throughout Europe. That's that reference to those two skulls, and that, to me, just screams that they don't know the difference between Neanderthal apomorphies and the archaic traits that are ancestral to humans and Neanderthals that have just stuck around in these ancient populations of humans until they were eventually selected out. Okay, Thomas Huxley and many contemporary paleo experts, that is, 12th ulcer, something like that, have further noted that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens can be arranged into a morphological continuum, which argues against their separateness as a species. Being able to arrange into a morphological continuum is going to create many problems if they're going to address the hominins. Let's just say it that way. Not surprisingly, lumpers have insisted that Neanderthals should be reclassified as Homo sapiens. They talk about the pit of bones. They talk about coexistence, contemporaneity, and interbreeding. We already talked about all that. Neanderthal burial sites corroborate what the DNA is now showing. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals live together in the same communities, intermarried. Got some bad news for you if you think that all those interbreeding events were marriage related. Worked together and were buried together. Finally, archaeological evidence recorded over the last few decades have refuted the myth that Neanderthals were intellectually inferior to modern humans. In conclusion, the evidence from paleontology, archaeology, and modern genetics all dramatically confirm that Neanderthal people were in every respect fully human. Neanderthal is us. I just put nope. So, that concludes our Neanderthal chapter. And I kind of want to talk about what I think the biggest, I'm trying to grab my pen here, what I think the biggest problems with this are, because there are many, and a lot of it a lot of it is unprofessional. So I've whipped out the whiteboard to give kind of a few final thoughts about how I think this chapter of Contested Bones went. Not well. One of the first things that should immediately jump out is the use of the biological species concept, right? This concept cannot be applied in the present uniformly any more than it can be applied in the past. So saying Neanderthals are Homo sapiens because they could interbreed is silly and inconsistent with how they treat existing populations. That is not a sound argument, unless they do want to argue that grizzlies and polar bears and lions and tigers are, same species as, like they're all just cats, right? I mean, I guess that is at least somewhat consistent with them. Number two, are morphologically distinct. Neanderthals and humans are morphologically distinct. That much is just not up for debate. But they're also genetically distinct. They fall into their own discrete categories, right? Where they are all the members of Neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens are more closely related to everyone within their own species than they are to one another, than anyone is to one another. And this also poses great difficulty for how Sanford and Roop want to treat Neanderthals, right? How do they fit into the creationism worldview? Because the only option based off of the genetics is to say that humans and Neanderthals, modern humans and Neanderthals, both descended from some mysterious ancient hominin that was created in the Garden of Eden, and then after sin, both of our respective groups degraded into what we are today and what we were in the past. And I don't think that they're going to do that anytime soon. So the bottom line is, are Neanderthals a separate species? I think so. I think that if we're being consistent, they fall into a separate species just as much as many of our extant groups do. Are they morphologically distinct? Yes. Are they genetically distinct? Yes. So can we say that Neanderthals are just humans instead of a vitally important piece of evolutionary history showing that the human terminal branch is not the only way that a hominin can kind of eke out a living through long periods of time? Well, I think I've answered it for you already. So my gentle and of course very modern apes, thank you for being here. I'm going to go get some of these ulcers checked, and I believe our next hominin is actually going to be Homo erectus, which is going to be even more interesting than Neanderthals because their status on Homo erectus is, if memory serves, leaving a lot to be desired. So please do stay safe out there, and I will see you next time.